Chapter 7 of The Last Rebel by Joseph A. Altsheler. Besiegers and Besieged. The doctor compelled to return, I took the flag and advanced with it. But the Colonel hated a Yankee spy as much as a traitor, and warned me off in short order. We gave the flag to one of the soldiers, whom the Colonel allowed to approach a little closer. They held a brief dialogue, and then our messenger came back to us, announcing that the Colonel regarded all his men as traitors or deserters, and would parley no further with them. They might besiege him if they would, but he meant to take a last stand for the Confederacy. "Was he well?" I asked the man. "I didn't see him at all," he replied, "for he talked through a chink in the wall, but his voice was mighty high and had a crack in it." This confirmed me in my belief that privation and excitement had mastered the Colonel. Nevertheless, we must sit down to a siege of the last rebel. We arranged our forces in such manner as he could not leave the hut and escape unseen into the further mountains. We waited an hour. Then, as the Colonel in his castle made no sign, I and a soldier went back for Grace. We found her in the hut, waiting impatiently to hear from us, and she did not show much surprise when I told her that her father had fortified himself against us. She came at once with us, and we sent her to the Colonel's castle. She returned in a quarter of an hour, much cast down, and told us he was in a fever, with wild eyes and flushed face. He refused to come out, and nothing she said could move him. He even spoke harsh words to her, saying she had joined his enemies. We sent her back with a couple of blankets and some provisions, and then she returned to us again. The Colonel would allow no second person in his defensive works. It looked like a long siege, and we prepared for it. We soon found Crothers and his party, and we built another shack in the woods, bringing from it the furs and other useful articles in the hut. It was well that we did the work quickly, for Grace fell quite ill with hardships and excitement, and soon was in a fever and talking a bit wildly. We put her in the shack on a bed of furs, and Dr. Ambrose, who did not have the title of doctor in vain, attended her, and said she would be all right in a day or so. But her illness was a misfortune, for she was the only one who could be considered a strict neutral and could carry messages between our little army and the Colonel. We were sufficient in number to form a picket around Fort Hetherhill, for so I named the Colonel's shack, but we were very careful not to come within range of its defender's rifle. One of the men, a good fellow named Kimball, went a little closer than the rest of us, and the prompt discharge of the rifle from Fort Hetherhill showed that the Colonel was watching. The bullet skipped across the ice 50 feet short of its mark. Kimball moved farther away. Having posted the men, I made a round and cautioned each to watch faithfully. But the caution was scarcely necessary. Every man there was under heavy obligations to the Colonel for something or other, and all meant to take him alive. It was cold work there on the ice, but we had brought provisions with us, and that supply, coupled with what was stored in the hut, prepared us amply for a siege in form. We made some coffee and served it to the men on picket duty, following it up a little later with a nip of whiskey for each, and they felt quite warm and comfortable. The Colonel, after his rifle shot, rested on his arms and maybe looked to his defenses. The piece of old stove pipe which projected through the roof began to smoke, showing that he had firewood, and that he too was able to keep warm. It looked like a long siege. The general commanding, who was myself, and Crothers, the second in command, held a council of war and decided to postpone operations until nightfall, when Crothers thought he would be able, under cover of the darkness, to steal upon the Colonel and take him. Then we waited for the slow afternoon to limp away. The sun was of a dazzling brightness, but there was no warmth in it. The ice fields glittered under the rays, but did not melt. The light was reflected, and with half-shut eyes we watched the peaks and the coated trees. Sometimes faint blue, purple, and green tints showed through the white glare. "Crothers," said I, "if I ever go on another winter campaign like this, I will not forget a pair of green goggles, largest size." "I wish I had them now," said Crothers. The glow on the ice fields turned to gold as the sun began to set behind the highest peak. From gold shifted to a blood red, and as the sun went out of sight, faded and left the pale green of a wan twilight. "These sheets of ice are in our way in more ways than one," said Crothers. "They light up the night so much that I could put a bullet in a silver quarter at 20 paces." "Do you think the Colonel could do as well?" I asked, somewhat anxiously. We thought it well to wait until past midnight, when the night would be darkest. So we served supper and hot coffee, relieved the pickets, and waited. The Colonel in his fortress seemed to be content. At least he gave no sign. Dr. Ambrose reported that Miss Hetherhill was much better, and would be on her feet again in the morning. The night limped as painfully as the day, and had the added demerit of being colder. A wind came down from the northeast, and there was a raw, sharp edge to it. I shivered, and my bones creaked with cold inside the heavy overcoat Crothers had given me. May the good Lord deliver me from any more winter campaigns. The moon, pale and icy, rose, and its chilly rays were reflected from the more chilly ice. Pieces of ice blown from the crusted boughs rattled dryly as they fell. As Crothers had foretold, the white glare of the earth lighted up the night until objects were almost as distinct as by daylight. The outlines of Fort Hetherhill were clear. I could even trace the ridges in the bark. Any of us advancing would make a most beautiful target, and we stuck to our determination to wait for further darkness. The column of smoke from the Colonel's hut increased, as if he, too, felt the growing cold and would ward it off. Midnight came, and shortly afterward the heavens began to darken. The outlines of Fort Hetherhill grew dimmer. I could no longer trace the ridges in the bark. Then the hut itself became an indistinct mass, seeming to wave in the wind, which still came down from the mountain tops and presented bayonet points to us. The time seemed favorable for an advance upon the enemy's fortifications. Our plan was very simple. We formed a circle around the hut, intending to contract this circle until we reached the house itself, when we would rush in and seize the garrison. The difficult part of it was to steal up so silently that the garrison would not hear us coming. To do it, we would be compelled to creep along, taking advantage of every elevation that would shelter us. Crothers and I started from adjacent points in the little wood, and set out upon our hazardous advance. The ground was broken and rough, and I soon lost sight of him. But despite his efforts to be noiseless, I could hear his heavy-soled boots scraping over the ice, and his breath puffy like that of a man who was working hard. I dare say I was interrupting the atmosphere in a similar manner, but then I was criticizing Crothers, not myself. I got along pretty well, and was halfway to Fort Hetherhill. I ceased to hear Crothers for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I heard him scraping along and puffing as before. As we had come half the distance without trouble or resistance, I thought I would go over to him and hold another conference. It seemed to me that we needed at least one more council of war before attacking the hut, if we were to follow strictly the mode of procedure prescribed in the military manuals. Turning about, I crept and slid toward him until a little ridge not more than half a foot high divided us. I could see his figure stretched out on the ice, and I reached out to touch him. But I was anticipated, for he reached up and grasped me by the throat with 2 very strong hands. Then I saw that instead of stalking Colonel Hetherhill, he had stalked me. The stalker was stalked, and I recognized it in a fact as painful as it was alarming. The Colonel seemed to me to be prodigiously strong for the sick man the soldier had reported him to be. His hands compressed my throat so tightly that I could not cry out, and my limbs were paralyzed, an unpleasant situation for an invading army, I willingly admit. The Colonel's eyes were angry, and his face was very red, which could be the result both of fever and of wrath. Both, I think, added to the strength of his arms. He sat up on the ice and held me out at arm's length like a big doll. I knew that Crothers was near, and I wanted to cry out instantly, and wanted to do it very badly. But for the life of me I could not, with that old Confederate's iron fingers on my throat. I had no doubt that Crothers and the men would continue to creep upon the hut, rush into it, and find nobody there. Meanwhile I would be turning into a cold corpse on the ice. The Colonel released his hold upon my throat so suddenly that I fell upon my back and gasped, which, however, was much better than not breathing at all. "Why did you do that?" I asked, feeling injured in the spirit as well as in the flesh. "It was my intention to kill you," he said, "but I've changed my mind." "Thank Heaven!" I exclaimed, devoutly. "I couldn't do it. It was too easy," he said. If that was the reason, I was not so thankful. But I considered it good policy not to explain my views just then. Although the Colonel had released me, he kept his hand on the butt of a very large pistol in his belt. I thought it wise to withdraw. "Good evening, Colonel," I said, giving the military salute as well as I could in my undignified position. "Good evening," he said. "This is a sortie of mine, understand, and if I have chosen to spare your life, it is for reasons of my own. I am going back to my house, and you would better notify your friends that I am awake and on guard. It may save them much hard work and a little loss of blood." He slipped back over the ice toward the fort with an agility marvelous in an old and ill man. Despite his calm manner, I had no doubt that fever was still in his veins. Being so nervous and excitable when well, it was natural that he should be calm when ill, especially in certain stages. I could see him for at least 20 feet, and then he disappeared in the darkness that now clothed the hut like a mask on a man's face. I felt no doubt that he was inside, ready to shoot down the first man who attempted to enter after him. In this emergency I thought it best to find Crothers, notify him that the attack had failed, and withdraw our forces. I believe a prudent general always withdraws when things go wrong. Moreover, I was getting very cold. Embracing the earth when it has an inch coat of ice on its bosom is no such delightful proceeding. Putting my ear to the ice, I heard the scraping of Crothers's hobnails not 15 feet away. I was sure that I was making no mistake this time, and I speedily overhauled him to find that it was the real Crothers. He coincided with my view that it would be better to withdraw, like the King of France of the ancient rhyme, and try again. He gave a whistle which may have been a part of the Confederate set of signals, though I don't know, and in a few minutes our entire army had retreated and assembled at our own hut, casualties none, and the enemy still in possession of his defenses. As we had satisfactory proof that the Colonel was vigilant, we decided to end the military operations for that night and devote what was left of it to keeping warm. The hut was occupied by Miss Hetherhill, whom the doctor reported to be in a sound slumber and doing well. As all the space under the shelter was necessarily reserved for the lady, we decided to build a big fire near the hut and sit around it until morning. It was a hard task, owing to the icy condition of the firewood, but we got it to going at last, and the cheerful, crackling blaze put heart in us all. We had no fear that the Colonel would come out and shoot at us in the light. He was not that kind of a soldier, and besides, his plan, as far as we could divine it, was to escape from us, not to inflict any special injury upon us. Dr. Ambrose was somewhat cast down at our failure to seize the Colonel at the first attempt, but his spirits were revived presently, and when I asked him to tell me about some of the old battles in which he and the Colonel and the others present, except myself, had fought, he became animated, and time ceased to limp. An hour of this, and the doctor broke off abruptly. As Crothers and I had been in the thick of the campaign all the time, he suggested that we roll ourselves in our blankets and try to get a little sleep by the fire. We followed his advice, and in 5 minutes I was dead to the world and its vanities. But presently I was dragged back out of infinite depths and told to sit up and open my eyes. "Why, I have just closed them, and it was at your suggestion," I said to Crothers. "You've been asleep for the last 3 hours. Wake up and look at the weather." I thought the weather a trifling pretext to awake a man from such pleasant slumbers, but when I looked about I saw better. The air had turned much warmer. There was a smack of wet in it, which to an experienced man was certain proof of snow to come, and more of it, too, than the skim of the day before. Even in the skies, naturally dark from the night, we could see heavy masses of clouds rolling. "It will begin inside of a half hour," said Dr. Ambrose. "And a snowstorm in the mountains is no light matter, Doctor," I said. "Certainly not." A deep snow would be sure to put a great check upon our military operations. It might even make our own situation precarious, for one must have food and keep warm. We bestirred ourselves with the utmost vigor, gathering firewood, and soon had a huge heap of it beside the hut. But the snow came inside the doctor's predicted half hour, and with 10 minutes to spare. The clouds opened, and it just dropped down. The skim of ice was soon covered, which was an advantage, saving us some falls and bruises, but it impeded the work on our new house. It was perfectly obvious to us all that we must have shelter from such a snowfall. We were trying to make a sort of rude shed with sticks and brushwood in the lee of a cliff. My comrades were old hands at the business, and it was marvelous how expert they were. With some sticks and brushwood, 2 or 3 blankets to help out on the roof, which they banked up in ridges at the sides, they made a comfortable place. I was busy on this rude structure and trying to keep the snow out of my eyes, when some one tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You are a promising architect, Mr. West." I looked around in the greatest surprise and beheld Grace Hetherhill, pale but otherwise showing no traces of illness. The heavy dark cloak which she wore when we started was buttoned high up around her throat, and a neat dark fur cap enclosed her hair. She looked very handsome and picturesque. "I congratulate you, Miss Hetherhill, on your speedy recovery," I said. "It was merely nervousness and excitement," she replied. "A draught of something very bitter that Dr. Ambrose gave me, and a good sleep, have restored me." "Very well," I said, thinking to cheer her up. "Then there is no reason why you should not help in the making of the camp, and show that you are a better architect than I am." "I am mountain bred in part, at least," she said, "and I know hardships. What may I do?" "Take hold of the end of that pole," I said, "and lift." She seized it, and with strong young muscles lifted it up. I was at the other end, and together we swung it into place. "That does pretty well for a rebel lass," I said. "Here you are the rebel," she said, "for this is our territory, and you are our prisoner." "What's this? What's this?" cried Dr. Ambrose. His back had been turned toward us, and he had not seen the approach of Miss Hetherhill. "Just up from a fever, and out here in the snow? Go back in the hut." There was sound sense in his command, and I added my advice to it, but she would not go until we assured her that Colonel Hetherhill was safe in his own hut, and pointed to the curl of smoke which still came from his stove pipe. On second thought, we took our own little hut and moved it boldly to the shed, deeming it best that all our forces should keep as close together as possible. Then, our main task finished, we took breakfast and watched the snow, casting an occasional glance toward Fort Hetherhill. We were glad on the whole now that the snow had come, for if we should be snowed up, the Colonel would be treated likewise, and perhaps it would induce him to hoist the white flag. The day had come, but it was a very dark and dreary pattern of a day. I have seen some people who imagine that Kentucky has a warm climate. It may have in summer, and so for the matter of that has Manitoba, but for real deep snows, or piercing cold that goes right through your bones and comes out on the other side, I will match the Kentucky mountains against anything this side of the Arctic Circle. The snow that morning seemed bent upon making a record. Some of the flakes looked like big white goose feathers. Nor was there any nonsense about them. They came straight down and took their appointed place on the earth. Others immediately fell and covered them up, and in turn were served the same way. There was no wind at all. The clouds were drawn like a huge dirty blanket across the sky, and gave to everything except the snow itself a muddy, grayish-brown tint. Presently we heard a sharp report in the adjacent forest, and then another, followed speedily by another and many others, until they blended often together like a rolling rifle fire. A dreaming veteran might have thought he was back in the wars, but none of us stirred, for each knew that it was the boughs of the trees breaking with a snap under the weight of new snow. "That might scare a man who was never in the woods in big snow time," said Crothers, who had lighted a pipe and was taking things calmly. The snow deepened faster than I had ever seen it before. I could mark it by the way the surface lines crept up the side of our rude shed. A few hours of such industrious clouds, and the mountains would be past traveling. The skies made promise of nothing else. There was no break in the dun expanse. The defiant curl of smoke from the Colonel's little fort still rose. I devoutly hoped that he would remember soon to come out and join us. Then we could go back together to Fort Defiance, and make merry behind stout walls that cared nothing for snow and cold. But his hut remained tightly closed, and the snow was deepening as fast as ever. Since the Colonel would make no sign, it became evident to me that we must. I called again my council of officers, the doctor and Crothers. "There is nothing else for us to do," I said, "but send Miss Hetherhill to the hut and see if she cannot persuade her father to join us." "He has said that he would not admit her a second time," said the doctor. "She must push her way in," I said. "The door to that hut is not strong, and a father would not fire upon his own daughter." They agreed that my plan was the only thing feasible, and we called Miss Hetherhill. She was eager to undertake the mission. She had been waiting to propose it, but held back, expecting us to act first. She started at once toward the hut, which was only 200 or 300 yards away, but her progress was slow. The snow, which had now attained a great depth, blocked the way. We watched her breaking her path through it toward the hut, where the Colonel was silent and invisible. The little building seemed almost crushed under its weight of snow, but the languid coil of smoke still curled from the mouth of the pipe. Miss Hetherhill was within 20 feet of the door. "The Colonel hasn't taken notice yet," said the doctor. "It would be funny if she should find him sound asleep, and in our power for hours, if we had only thought to take him." I watched with eager interest as the 20 feet between Miss Hetherhill and the door diminished. She reached the door and knocked. As she stood there and waited, I guessed that she received no answer. She knocked a second time, waited a minute or so, and then pushed the door open and entered. She ran out again in a moment, uttering a cry and turning a dismayed face toward us. We ran to the hut as fast as we could, plunging through the snow. I was the first to arrive. When I thrust my head in at the open door, I saw that the place was empty. Some coals still smouldered upon the flat stone which served for a rude fireplace. A dressed deerskin lay in the corner, but the Colonel was gone beyond a doubt. One large man would nearly fill the place. "He's taken his rifle and ammunition with him," said Crothers, "so he's all right." I was glad that he had called attention to the fact so promptly, for it seemed to indicate deliberation and not delirium on the Colonel's part. There was no need to ask what next from the men about me. Their obligations to the Colonel would never permit them to abandon the search for him as long as one hope that he was alive existed. But the great snow was a formidable obstacle to any expedition. "How shall we go about it?" I asked hopelessly of Dr. Ambrose. "There is no trail," he replied. "The falling snow covers up his footsteps a half minute after he makes them. But he must have gone up that slash through the hills there. It is the easiest route from here, and the one a man with no fixed idea in his head would most likely take." There was a general agreement with the doctor's opinion, and we planned our pursuit at once. 4 men would remain at the camp and protect it, and relieve us should we return exhausted and without the fugitive. Miss Hetherhill would remain with them. She made some demur, saying she was a good mountaineer and citing proof, but she yielded to the obvious fact that a woman could make but little progress through the deep snow. "We will be sure to bring him back," I said to her when we started. "Take care of yourself, too," she said. "For my sake only?" I asked. "For all our sakes," she replied. But she blushed a little, despite the anxiety which was foremost in her mind. We passed up the defile, and then our party spread out like a fan. I was convinced that the Colonel could not have gone far. The snow was an added obstacle to the naturally difficult character of the mountains. It was still pouring down, half blinding us, and compelling us to scrutinize every inch of the way, lest the loosening drifts should carry us in an avalanche to the bottom of some precipice, which would be highly disagreeable. Chapter 8. The Results of a Snowslide. Dr. Ambrose and I stuck together, picking our way through the storm. Snow-covered mountains under an angry sky are not a cheerful prospect, and the work was fearfully tiresome. Down my boot would crush under my weight through a foot of snow, and to lift it out again was like drawing a wedge from a log. It was winter, but I grew hot, and my brow produced sweat. My breath shortened, and my muscles said they were tired. The doctor noticed me. "You'd better go back, Mr. West," he said. "This is very exhausting business for one who is not used to it." But I was a bit ashamed of playing out so soon, and insisted upon going on. He said nothing then, but when he raised the question a half hour later, I was forced to confess that he was right. A tuckered-out man was of no use on such a trail. "You'd better go straight back to the camp, and I've no doubt you'll find one or two there who played out before you did," he said. Leaving him regretfully, I faced about and began to plow my way through the snow on the return journey. I had noted the landmarks well, and recognized them easily. The snow, still falling, had buried all trace of our footsteps under 2 or 3 inches of white. I tugged along with a fair degree of patience, wishing at the same time that I was back at the camp, drying my boots and drinking a hot toddy. Unpicturesque, but pleasant occupations. But walking beat wishing, and at last I saw the smoke of our camp fire over a hill. I increased my speed, trying to make a run through the deep snow. I passed near the edge of a cliff, but no nearer than we had gone when we started on the search. I forgot that the snow had grown deeper and more weight was pressing down upon the slopes. When I was nearest the edge, the snow seemed to slip from under my feet. The mountain tilted up at a new angle. There was the rumble of tons of snow sliding over the steeps, and away it went in a huge white avalanche, bearing me, who had started it, upon its crest, sick with sudden fear. The itch of life was in my fingers. It, and no thought of mine, made me reach out and grasp at the sturdy shrubs which grew on the mountainside. With each handful I hung on, and shouted and kicked. Big waves of snow tumbled over me and loosened my arms in their sockets, but I swung to my brave bushes until I had received my last douse of snow, and the slope was swept clean. I managed to get my toes into a cleft, and my arms felt better. My head was beginning to think and come to the relief of instinct. I saw that I was about 10 feet from the crest of the cliff, which was not far, but too far. I tried to draw myself up by the bushes, but I was no sailor, and I failed. Then I shouted with all my might. I had seen the smoke of the camp just before my fall, and I hoped my voice would reach the men there. I never knew before that I had such a good voice. "Hello!" I shouted. The mountains took up the cry and sent it back to me. "What's the matter down there?" cried out someone. "The matter?" I said angrily. "There's no matter at all. I came down here merely for amusement. I do this sort of thing often." I looked up and saw the red face of Colonel Hetherhill peeping over the brink at me. "Ah, it's young West, the Yankee spy," he said. "I'm young West, I'll admit, but I'm no Yankee spy," I replied. "I insist that you are a Yankee spy," he said, in an infernally calm and convincing manner. "What proof can you give that you are not?" "Colonel," I cried, and I'm sure that my tone was convincing, "for heaven's sake, drop that Yankee spy business and get me out of this." "Sir," he said very stiffly, "I have accused you of being a Yankee spy, and I will compel you to admit that you are a Yankee spy." "Colonel," I shouted, "my arms are growing tired, and so are my toes, and it is at least 200 feet to the bottom." "Sir," he said, still very stiff and haughty, "I despise falsehoods, and so do all Southern gentlemen. You are a Yankee spy, and you still have the face to deny it." "Pull me up, Colonel," I cried. "I'm getting awful tired." "Are you not a Yankee spy?" he asked. I thought I felt some of the muscles in my arms cracking. The time to despise trifles had arrived. "Yes, Colonel," I said. "I'll admit that I'm a Yankee spy, or anything else you want to charge against me." "Good enough," he said. "Now, when I let my coat down, grip it with your right hand, and hold on as if you had grown to it." He pulled off his Confederate overcoat, curved his left arm around a jutting rock, and with his right hand lowered the coat to me. I embedded my right hand in the gray garment, and grasping with the other at the short shrubs, tried to scramble up. I did get about halfway, but as I could find no more crevices for my toes, I hung there, limp and exhausted. "I can't do it, Colonel," I gasped. "You must," he said. He tried to draw me up, but I was too heavy a weight for a single arm. He was half over the gulf himself, but his left arm was wound like a cable around the rock. His face was red as a beet, and his breath was short, but he showed no inclination to let go. "You can't do it, Colonel," I gasped. "Save yourself. No need for both of us to drop." "What sort of a man do you take me to be?" he asked, indignantly. He breathed hard and made a great effort to pull me up. A flake of blood appeared on his temple. I was raised up about a foot, and got a new grip on some of the shrubs, but there I stopped. I could not lift myself up any farther, nor could the Colonel lift me. I could hear men plunging through the snow in their haste, so my shouts had been heard by more than the Colonel. I put my voice to its best uses again. The Colonel said nothing, but how he hung onto that old army overcoat. The men had begun to shout, and I never ceased, wanting them to make sure of the direction. Weather-steamed faces looked over the brink. 2 or 3 pairs of hands grasped the overcoat and pulled me up. Somebody else seized the Colonel, and I have but a hazy idea of the next 5 minutes. A man who has been hanging at the verge of death gets tired in both brain and muscle, and I needed rest. When things came around all right again, I was sitting up on the snow and drinking out of a brown bottle. The Colonel was lying on that blessed overcoat, his head on his daughter's lap, and his face quite pale. They were binding a white cloth around his temples. "What's the matter?" I asked, weakly. "An old wound on his head has broken," replied one of the men, in a low voice. "I'm afraid he's in a pretty bad way." I put down the brown bottle which had comforted me, and I saw that the Colonel in fact was in a bad way. He was unconscious, and his breathing was weak. He seemed to have collapsed after a season of fever and excitement, followed by the great physical strain put upon him by the attempted rescue of me. I was struck with remorse. My arrival at Fort Defiance had caused all this trouble. Yet my going there was an accident, not a matter that I could have helped. I sent one of the men after Dr. Ambrose, pointing out the direction in which he had gone, and urging the man to make all haste. Then we lifted the Colonel and carried him to the hut, where with overcoats and blankets we fixed up a warm bed for him, and did what else we could until the doctor came, which was not till late. "He has about an even chance, Miss Hetherhill," said the doctor, after he had made his examination. "The odds might be his if I had here all that I need, but this is no hospital. I think it is best to tell you the exact truth." I thought so too. There are women and women. Some are brave and some are not. I like the brave ones best. She became chief nurse at once. Lucky it is for a man ill in such a place to have a woman's care. I, still feeling remorse, although my reason told me I was not at fault, helped all I could. The snow ceased, and toward evening the Colonel grew stronger. Dr. Ambrose had managed to close up the reopened wound and stop the bleeding, but a burning fever came over him, and he began to talk very wildly. Then I saw how the things on which a man's mind is centered when he wakes come out again in sleep or delirium. His talk was all of the war and the old battles, which he was fighting as if he rode and charged in them again. I, who loved the Union, could not help feeling a deep sympathy for him, he seemed to have taken the matter so much to heart. When he rambled on to the end of the war, that is, the end according to history, and repeated again and again his declaration to stand out forever, I was touched, and touched very deeply. Someone brought him the news that Lee was dead. "I will not believe it," he cried in his delirium. "It's a lie. He is living, and he will lead us again." He rose suddenly, and fixing his fever-filled eyes upon me, demanded of me to bear witness that it was a lie. "Yes, Colonel," I said as soothingly as I could, "it's a lie. The General is living, and he is your commander still. I think I will get forgiveness for my own lie." After a while he sank into something which resembled sleep more and delirium less, and was quiet. Miss Hetherhill stepped to the little door for air. Only she and I were there. "Miss Hetherhill," I said, reproaching myself, "how you must blame me for bringing all this grief upon you and yours." "You could not help it," she said, very gently. "And perhaps, as I told you before, it may be for the best, after all. A rough cure may be the best cure." Dr. Ambrose came up then, and insisted that we should take rest while others watched. We fenced off a corner of the camp for Grace. I sought my own place, and was soon sound asleep. In the morning I found the Colonel in delirium again, though not so violent as he had been in the early part of the night. He was talking about me. I seemed to weigh upon his conscience, as he had weighed upon mine. He had never meant to do it, he said. He would not have executed me, though he still seemed to think that his military duty commanded it. At any rate, he was apologizing to me in his sleep, when a man's talk speaks his thoughts, and no falsehoods or evasions. "How could I execute him?" he said. "And we slept under the same blanket, too." The second attack of delirium did not last long, and Dr. Ambrose then said that the patient's progress was good. If we could only get him back to Fort Defiance, he would guarantee his recovery. The snow had ceased, and the clouds had gone, leaving a cheerful sun shining on a white wilderness. we decided to undertake the journey to Fort Defiance, and our preparations were brief. We had sufficient skill and material to make a rude litter for the Colonel, and we lifted him gently into it. Then we gathered up our baggage and set out, 4 men carrying the litter, and relieved at brief intervals by the other sets. We had to trample a way through the deep snow, and there was plenty of hard work for us, but we became a cheerful little army. The Colonel was asleep in his litter and seemed to be growing steadily better. The doctor reported that his pulse was stronger and his fever was departing. Grace passed from sadness into cheerfulness, almost gaiety. I called her our vivandière. She replied she was proud of the place. "You heard what my father said about you in his delirium?" she said, when we became the last 2 of the procession. "He would not have executed you." "Colonel Hetherhill is a fine man, and he has my gratitude," I replied, not liking to see her under the necessity of excusing him. "He saved my life a second time. If it hadn't been for him, I'd now be a very cold corpse at the bottom of a 200-foot precipice under about 15 feet of snow." "That would have been a chilly tomb," she said gaily. "But it was not for you, and we are all thankful." The weather, it seemed, wished to make some amends for its previous wickedness. The sun was bright and the air fresh and full of tonic. Only the snow stood in our way. But we made good progress in spite of it. At night we devised another rude camp, and took plenty of sleep. The Colonel continued to improve, and his head became quite clear again. He talked a little, but in a weak tone, and the doctor ordered him to be silent for his own good. He obeyed like a little child. In fact, his change in manner and appearance was very striking. He was no longer the haughty, high-tempered Colonel. He was crushed and forlorn. All the spirit seemed to have gone out of him. It was most pitiful. I felt sorrier than ever for him, for I knew he looked upon himself as a defeated man. We caught the first glimpse of Fort Defiance that afternoon. I saw the comb of its roof shining like a great white sword blade in the sun. The valley, like the mountains, was in garments of white, but the sight of the houses and fields, under snow though they were, warmed the heart after the weary tramp among the clefts and peaks. We descended the slopes and entered the valley. It was my turn to be one of the 4 at the Colonel's litter. As we swung along at a good pace, I noticed suddenly that the old man had put his hands to his face, and a tear was dropping between 2 fingers. I was silent for a while from respect, but as he did not take his hands away, I asked at last, though quietly as I could, "What is the matter, Colonel? Do you feel worse?" He took his hands away, and his face was like that of a dead man. "Not worse in body, Mr. West," he replied, "but worse, much worse, in mind. I have failed in everything, and through the treachery of my own people. You have corrupted them all. Even my own daughter has turned against me. I am going to Fort Defiance, which was our last stronghold, a prisoner." "Colonel," said I, "what are you thinking about? What are you dreaming of? You a prisoner? Fort Defiance betrayed? Look yonder." We were near the fort now, and I pointed to the Confederate flag that waved over it, folding and unfolding in the clear, frosty breeze. The Colonel looked, and his face changed in a moment from death to life. The blood flowed into his cheeks. His eyes sparkled like a soldier's, eager for battle. "Why, what does that mean?" he exclaimed. "Mean?" I said. "It means that you've been dreaming, or you wouldn't talk about being betrayed, a prisoner. What made you rush off in such a haste? Dr. Ambrose's suggestion of surrender was a sudden thought, of which he has repented. Fort Defiance is as loyal to you as ever. You are its absolute commander. I am the prisoner, not you." Dr. Ambrose had been walking by the litter. The Colonel beckoned to him. "Is this so, Dr. Ambrose?" he asked. "Is what Mr. West tells me true? Am I still master of my own?" "Certainly. How could it be otherwise?" replied the doctor, with great emphasis. "What are your orders, Colonel?" "Tell one of the men," he said, in a voice very firm despite its physical weakness, "to go on ahead to the fort, and direct those who are there to salute us as we approach. Mr. West, you are my prisoner, but there are certain circumstances in your favor which I will consider. You shall have the liberty of the fort and valley if you pledge your word not to attempt to escape for the present." "With pleasure, Colonel," I said, "and thank you for your kindness." "Grace," he said to his daughter, "remember that while Mr. West is our prisoner, he is to be treated as our guest. See to it, for I am afraid this unfortunate illness will interfere somewhat with my duties as host." "I will do my best," she said. We proceeded at a deliberate pace across the plain. As we came close to the fort, the little brass cannon boomed again and again. The drawbridge was down, and the men whom we left at the fort were drawn up at parade in their best uniforms on either side of the bridge head. They saluted as the Colonel rode proudly and triumphantly between their lines in his litter. He looked up at the flag which he loved so well, took off his hat, his face flushing with pride, and thus we carried him into the fort. Chapter 9. I am in favor. We sat again in the great drawing room at Fort Defiance. The military appearance of the apartment was unchanged. The portraits of the Confederate generals looked from wall to wall at each other. The bright sun, reflected from the snow outside, gleamed on the burnished arms. At the head of the table sat the Colonel in his most brilliant uniform, stiff and precise as a judge should be. Dr. Ambrose, at the side of the table, took their statements in writing, and 6 men in Confederate gray, Crothers at their head, listened attentively to the evidence. Thus my second trial on the charge of being a Yankee spy, appealed on a writ of error from the first, drew to its end. Miss Hetherhill sat beside the window. Streaks of dim gold showed in her dark hair where the winter sunshine fell across it. When her eyes met mine, a bit of a smile appeared in them, and the delicate color in her cheeks deepened. The last evidence was given, and the Colonel directed the military jury to retire to the next room and consider a verdict. When they had gone, we waited in silence. The snowbirds hopped about outside. One of them perched on the window sill and stared at us through the glass for a moment. Then he flew away. The snow on the knife edge of the distant mountain ridges shone like gold under the sun. The jury returned, Crothers at their head. "What is your verdict, gentlemen?" asked the Colonel. "Not guilty," replied Crothers. "It is our unanimous decision." "I am glad of it," said the Colonel. "It is my opinion, too. Mr. West, my congratulations and sympathy as from one honest enemy to another." He reached over and gave my hand a strong and friendly grasp. "Remember," he said, "that until we return you to your own country, you are our guest in the fullest sense of the word." Dr. Ambrose and Crothers also shook my hand, and everybody seemed to be glad that we had arrived at the truth at last. By and by only Grace and I were left in the room. We stood by the great window. The brilliant sunlight reflected from the snow threw a broad band of gold across the floor. Her face, for the first time since I knew her, seemed peaceful and content. The snowbirds hopped from one little white mound to another, like their brethren of the summer passing from flower to flower. 3 or 4 flew to the brave little brass cannon which menaced the passage of the drawbridge and perched upon its barrel. "They don't seem to fear the dogs of war," I said. "They need not," said Grace. "Our cannon will never be used again. The last salute cracked the barrel all the way." "Do you forgive me," I asked, asking the old question, "for bringing so much trouble upon Fort Defiance?" "There is nothing to forgive," she said, earnestly. "It was no fault of yours." I became brave. "Then you are not sorry I came?" "No." I took her hands in mine. "You are sorry I am going?" "Yes." I kissed her for the second time in my life. The day had come for me to leave Fort Defiance. The great snow had gone. The whole Confederate army, its commander at its head, accompanied me as a guard of honor to the end of the valley. Crothers would guide me across the mountains. When the time came for the others to turn back, Colonel Hetherhill shook my hand again. "You are a gallant and honest enemy," he said, paying me the highest compliment he knew. Grace walked a little farther. Then I took both her hands in mine, and kissed her for the third, but not the last time in my life. The trumpet sounded the recall from the walls of Fort Defiance. "I will come again," I said. "But not as an enemy." "Never as an enemy." End of chapter 9. End of The Last Rebel by Joseph A. Altsheler.